How's it going, everybody? This is Todd Abedrabbo. I hope you're having another great day, and welcome back to another video. Alright, it's time for another edition of Living with Disability. In this series, I talk about what life is like for people with an intellectual disability and how we can help those with intellectual disabilities succeed in life and have a chance at a successful, independent future. And for this one, I'm going to be talking about living independently with an intellectual disability. Now, this is one thing that I'm sure a lot of people with intellectual disabilities want to do. They ultimately do want to move out of their parents' home and ultimately live on their own. But just like with almost everything else that I talked about in this series prior, it's just so difficult because of the barriers that they face with an intellectual disability. So I'll tell you some of the challenges and where I think could be best for people with intellectual disabilities. Now, as I mentioned before, at least until you get to college, you ultimately have the comfort of living with your parents. You know, they're doing everything that they can to possibly raise you, ultimately give you all the skills that you need to ultimately survive life and ultimately get you to where you need to be. But just like everybody else in life, at some point, you ultimately have to move out of your own parents' home and ultimately start living on your own. Now, of course, there are a few factors in which that isn't possible. However, I'll share with you those in just a little bit. Most of the time, people after they graduate from college, they'll ultimately move into their own home and ultimately start using everything that they had previously learned in college to ultimately start living independently. You know, start making their own food, you know, do their own laundry, ultimately make everything around the house look spotless almost. And ultimately, to go along with that, they have their own job, you know, they have more time to hang out with their friends, and ultimately they just enjoy life as an independent. And literally, that's all you can really ask for if you really want to have a successful life. Now, of course, there are still some instances in which that is not possible. Like, for example, right now, home prices along with rent is still extremely high. And because of that, some people, as soon as they finish with college, they still have to live with their parents at home for a short period of time before ultimately prices start to drop and ultimately they are able to ultimately find their own home and live successfully. And of course, that might take a little while, you know. Usually it may take a few months, it might take a year, or maybe, you know, like a couple years down the road. I mean, it really depends on what the economy is like. And ultimately, though, by the late 20s or maybe, you know, the mid 30s or something like that, at some point they ultimately do have to have their own home. That ultimately becomes a lot tougher if you have an intellectual disability. Now, of course, having an intellectual disability means having to overcome a lot of barriers, and because of that, it makes it very hard to do a whole lot of things, and living independently is one of them. In fact, as far as I know, there is a very small number of people with an intellectual disability that are able to live successfully on their own, and a lot of the reasons is because they struggle to do a whole lot of things that everybody else does whenever they're living independently at their own home. Not only that, they just struggle to have the money to afford it, and because of that, you know, they have to continue living with their parents as long as possible and ultimately, you know, just find some good paying job for them to be able to do that. Take it from me, I'm obviously almost 27 years old, and ultimately because of how high home prices are right now, especially rent, that's the reason why I'm still struggling to be able to find a home. It's really because of the way home prices are right now. But again, that's just only one reason why people with intellectual disabilities are struggling to really get their own home. As I mentioned before, it is already hard for them to be able to find a job with an intellectual disability. And because of that, most of the time, most people with intellectual disabilities, they are not able to really find something immediately out of college based on their major. Because of that, you know, some people, they ultimately do have to find, you know, somewhere in retail, like I did for a short period of time. Maybe work at a restaurant, or maybe at a retail store, or maybe, you know, like just some sort of like, you know, a fashion store or something like that. Ultimately, a lot of people with intellectual disabilities, they struggle to even get out of college as a result. And so, unfortunately, for some of them, it's just not possible for them to be able to get their degree out of college and ultimately find a job in their major right away. And so, unfortunately, you know, some of them, they ultimately have to end up in retail for quite a while, unfortunately. And because of that, since they are very low paying, unfortunately, it only makes it that much harder for them to be able to afford getting their own home. Not only that, like I said before, it's just very hard for people with intellectual disabilities to be able to learn new things and also concentrate as well. Like, for example, you know, obviously learning finances, that is one thing that they struggle at, because ultimately, you know, because of their intellectual disability, it makes it very hard for them to be able to learn how much they need to pay every single month in regards to their home or their rent. Not only that, their insurance as well. Not only that, there are also a whole bunch of necessities that they also have to worry about as well. Like for example, if they have to drive themselves, obviously, like unless they're able to get like transportation through a bus or a train or something like that, how are they going to be able to get to work if they don't have like reliable transportation? And unfortunately, because of their intellectual disability, it only just makes it that much harder for them to be able to really get from their own home to their place of work and then ultimately all the way back, especially in instances where, you know, it's like a 9-to-5 job like I do. Ultimately, I do have that luxury because I do drive myself to work and back, but still, not many other people with intellectual disabilities are able to do that. And ultimately, all the stuff at home, like I said before, you know, you ultimately have to find a way to do your own laundry, obviously, you know. Most of the time when you were living at home, your parents were able to take care of that for you. You have to be able to do that on your own. And, you know, if you don't have like a laundromat at where you're living, chances are there's probably a laundromat nearby. But again, you know, it ultimately still requires a whole lot of things that you have to do because you really don't want to be out there in dirty or shady clothes. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people with intellectual disabilities that really need to learn to do their own laundry because they just struggle to be able to figure out how they're able to do it correctly. They also have to go out and get their own food. You know, chances are they're probably going to have to learn to make their own dinner as well. And unfortunately, because, you know, of all the things that they have to learn as a result of their intellectual disability, it makes it hard for them to be able to figure out where's a good place for them to eat, or maybe even find the best places to really go shop for groceries for cheap. You know, obviously, you know, they have to have their own fridge stocked up. And unfortunately, it's just much harder for them to do that because they don't know exactly where they're able to find all the food that they need to really survive a couple weeks or so. And like I said before, you know, obviously insurance, you know, you gotta pay for your home and your rent, obviously, which is already hard enough because of the way home prices are right now. But you also gotta worry about your car insurance as well. You gotta worry about your health insurance as well, your life insurance, heck, dental and vision insurance as well. You gotta worry about a whole lot of that. And because of, you know, how intellectual disabilities work, you know, it requires having to read through almost every single detail of each bill that comes in. And because of that, you know, they have a hard time concentrating as a result. And really, it just makes it that much harder for them to be able to pay for everything on their own without having that much difficulty. Trust me, I still want to have my own home, obviously, hopefully sooner than later, and I'm sure there are a lot of people with intellectual disabilities that would still want to have their own home as well. But unfortunately, it just gets really difficult because of all of the factors that I just mentioned here. And for parents, that leaves them with a very difficult decision that they have to make. Ultimately, there are 3 routes where they can possibly go. The first of which is just to see, you know, whether or not there is a caretaker around, like for example, you know, like a relative or maybe a friend of that person with an intellectual disability that they can live with. You know, obviously sharing a home with them, sometimes that may be the best thing that they can do for them, because obviously, you know, the fear is that they may not be able to do everything on their own. There's a chance that there's somebody that a person with an intellectual disability may have made friends with that ultimately they've become friends with for such a long time. Or obviously there's a relative, like let's say like, you know, an aunt or an uncle or maybe a cousin or something like that, that's care for them quite a bit as well and are open to having them around at their home. Obviously they still gotta follow the same rules there like they did with their parents, but hey, sometimes that may be the best route if you don't think they're able to afford having their own home and ultimately pay for everything. Trust me, friends and caregivers, sometimes they're a lot more caring for people with intellectual disabilities than you think. The second place, if they can afford their own home, however, they just really can't be able to pay for everything without a loss of concentration, is, you know, if you're gonna get them a home for rent or for free or something like that, you know, maybe just hire a caregiving service to be there for them every single time. You know, help them out with being able to really care for everything at home and ultimately just make sure that everything is nice and neat. I mean, obviously there might be a whole bunch of caregiving services obviously that is around, and ultimately, you know, having one in the house for somebody with an intellectual disability, that can really help those with being able to really pay everything, you know, ultimately get everything that they need so that way they can survive for a week or two and ultimately, you know, just survive life as well. Sometimes, you know, you can have your own home, but your intellectual disability can make it hard for you to be able to pay everything. Having that caregiver in your house, that can help. Finally, I think the third route that parents with someone with an intellectual disability can go is to put them in a residential living facility, or maybe even a group home. Maybe have that person with an intellectual disability be around others with intellectual disabilities, and ultimately just put them in a setting in which not only can they learn how to live independently, but also make a good amount of friends in doing so. Now, obviously, this is not a route I personally would rather go. I mean, obviously, the only way that I think you can really go that route is if it becomes clear that you really cannot afford to have those with an intellectual disability around your house anymore, and this is basically your last resort. But still, sometimes having someone in an intellectual disability at a residential home, hey, they can really have a lot of fun there. Obviously, it really gives them their own peace of mind, and ultimately, while still learning the ropes of ultimately paying for everything that they need to afford, hey, they can still have a whole lot of fun, because ultimately there are caregivers there, and also other people just like them that are living there as well. Sometimes that is recommended as well. There's probably more that I can think of as well, but those are really the three main routes for people with someone with an intellectual disability can go. And ultimately, this can give them all the possibilities of being able to live independently without the fear of not being able to afford anything, and ultimately being able to live life successfully with an intellectual disability as an adult. Trust me, I know it's very hard in this economy to be able to do that, but it is still possible. Just like with surviving school, ultimately getting a job, and ultimately building a web of friends as well, living independently is another barrier that becomes really hard for somebody with an intellectual disability to be able to do, because of all the struggles that they face in regards to communication, also with concentrating on learning new things, and ultimately, just having a successful life. But again, most of the time though, there are a whole bunch of other people that have been able to really overcome that barrier and ultimately live independently with an intellectual disability. It is still possible, though the avenues for that is still very narrow. But again, residential facilities, having them live with a friend or a caretaker or something like that, those are routes where parents of someone with an intellectual disability can take. And ultimately, there are other ways to be able to do that. But again, people with intellectual disabilities, they want to live life just like everybody else does. And ultimately, living independently is another thing that comes in mind in regards to that. So obviously, do what you can to try to help those with an intellectual disability find their own home and ultimately live successfully as well, because they want to live the adult life just like everybody else. And having their own home can really give them that real peace of mind, knowing that they are living as a very happy adult. Alright, that's going to do it for this video. I actually have another topic in regards to this that I will be talking about for my next Living with Disability video next Wednesday, so stay tuned next week. I'm sure that's going to be a very interesting thing that I'm going to talk about. But like I said before, there's only just a short amount of time left in my Champion of the Year campaign, so if you have not donated so far, please do so. The donation link is in the description below. It's going to help people like me, my mission partner Danny Margulies, and everybody else that is affiliated with Best Buddies International and Best Buddies New Jersey in promoting all the great programs and chapters that they have, and ultimately helping those with an intellectual disability succeed in life. So only 3 weeks left, so if you haven't done so, I really beg of you, please donate in my campaign. The link is in the description below. Anyways, that's going to do it for this video. I hope you all enjoyed it. As always, if you'd like to see more of my content, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you know my latest video is released. Comment below for future suggestions for all my videos, whether it's blogs, projects, or challenges, you name it. Leave it in the comments below, and I'll do my best to make them. As always, follow me on my social media. All the links are in the description below. That's going to do it for this video. I hope you're having another great day. And as always, I hope to see you all again in another video very soon. So long, everybody.